Most people think they know the story of the 1793 Philadelphia yellow fever. A brutal summer heat, a mysterious sickness sweeping through the city, doctors bleeding their patients because nobody understood what they were dealing with. Mosquitoes everywhere, nobody connecting them to anything. President Washington packing up and heading home to Mount Vernon before the worst of it hit. A tragedy born of ignorance in a young country that simply didn't have the medicine yet. By the time it was over, more than 5,000 people were dead. In a city of 50,000. That's 1 in every 10 residents, gone in about 3 months. It's not wrong exactly, but it's dangerously incomplete. Here's the problem with that version of events. It treats Philadelphia's epidemic as something that started in Philadelphia. It didn't. What hit that city in the summer of 1793 wasn't a local accident of bad luck and bad hygiene. It was the far edge of a revolution, and a financial system barely a few years old, colliding on the same stretch of riverfront docks. The real story starts with 2 ships, not 1. The first carried refugees fleeing a slave uprising thousands of miles south in a French colony most Americans had never given much thought to. The second had left an entirely different continent months earlier, on a completely unrelated voyage, and had been quietly leaving fever behind at every port it touched on its way north. Neither captain knew about the other. Neither was trying to bring anything to Philadelphia at all. And they arrived in the same city, in the same season, while that city happened to be serving as the capital of a brand new nation whose entire financial system was still being built by the men now living inside it. So let me take you back, not to the Philadelphia docks in August, but to a sugar colony 4,000 miles south in the summer of 1791. Saint-Domingue was at the time the single most profitable colony on earth. French planters were pulling staggering wealth out of sugar and coffee, worked by an enslaved population that outnumbered the free colonists many times over. In August of 1791, that population rose up. Within weeks, plantations across the north of the colony were burning. The uprising would become the Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave revolt in history to produce an independent nation, and it was still unfolding brutally in 1793. To understand why this mattered so much, it helps to understand what Saint-Domingue actually was before 1791. This was a colony roughly the size of Maryland, producing close to half of all the sugar and coffee consumed in Europe. French planters had built staggering fortunes on it, fortunes that depended entirely on an enslaved population that outnumbered them by something like 10 to 1. It was by most economic measures of the era, the single richest colonial possession on the planet. That imbalance, a tiny planter class sitting on top of an enormous, brutalized labor force, wasn't a side detail. It was the entire structural reason the uprising, once it started, proved impossible to contain. France responded the way empires respond. It sent soldiers. Now here's where the story starts moving in a direction nobody in Philadelphia was watching for. Those French soldiers sent to put down the revolt were dying, not primarily in battle, but from tropical disease. Yellow fever moved through European garrisons in the Caribbean with a speed and lethality that shocked commanders used to European warfare. Whole regiments were being hollowed out by fever before they ever saw serious combat. Soldiers who'd survived skirmishes with revolutionary forces were dying in their barracks weeks later, and French commanders had no framework for understanding why a tropical fever could do more damage to an occupying army than the enemy could. That mattered because it meant the French colonial project in Saint-Domingue was collapsing on 2 fronts at once: a slave revolution it couldn't put down, and a disease environment it couldn't survive in. And collapsing colonies produce refugees. Lots of them, and fast, because when a plantation economy built on forced labor starts burning, everyone attached to it, planters, merchants, free people of color, and in many cases enslaved people themselves, has to decide almost overnight whether to run. Beginning in 1791, and accelerating through 1792 and into 1793, white planters, free people of color, and in many cases the enslaved people they still considered property began fleeing the colony in whatever ships they could find. Some went to Cuba, some to Jamaica. A great many came north to the United States, and disproportionately to Philadelphia, which by 1793 had become the young country's capital and its largest, wealthiest port. Now here's the thing about a refugee fleeing a burning plantation in a hurry. You don't check the ship's hold for mosquito larvae. You get on board. The ships arriving from Saint-Domingue that spring were carrying more than passengers. They were carrying the water barrels, the bilge water, and the breeding conditions that Aedes aegypti, the mosquito species that transmits yellow fever, needs to survive a long ocean crossing. And in many cases they were carrying people already incubating the virus, or already sick. Philadelphia, meanwhile, was not exactly a neutral bystander waiting to receive them. By 1793, the city had already absorbed roughly 3,000 French immigrants that year alone, a mix of people fleeing the revolution in France itself and people fleeing Saint-Domingue. And the reception they got wasn't simple sympathy. An incident that spring known as the Genet Affair, in which France's ambassador tried to draw the United States into its war against Britain by commissioning American privateers on American soil, had already inflamed suspicion of French nationals generally. Federalist Philadelphians, wary of the revolution's growing violence and Genet's brazen overreach, increasingly painted French arrivals as dangerous radicals, regardless of whether they were fleeing a plantation colony or a Parisian mob. That suspicion would matter enormously once bodies started turning up on North Water Street, because it gave the city a ready-made villain before anyone had bothered to trace where the fever actually came from. That's one thread. Here's the second, and it starts on a completely different ocean. Also in 1792, a British ship called the Hankey set out from London on an entirely unrelated mission, an idealistic, poorly planned attempt to found a free colony on the island of Balama, off the coast of what is now Guinea-Bissau in West Africa. The plan, championed by British abolitionist reformers, was to establish a settlement built on free labor rather than slavery, a kind of proof-of-concept colony meant to demonstrate that West African trade could function without the slave trade underpinning it. The colonists who boarded her had nothing to do with France, nothing to do with Saint-Domingue, and no idea they were about to become part of one of the deadliest disease events in early American history. It's a strange detail if you sit with it. One ship carrying an anti-slavery experiment, and one set of refugee ships carrying people fleeing the collapse of a slave economy, both destined to end up entangled in the same outbreak on the same American coastline. The Balama venture failed almost immediately. Disease tore through the settlers, likely yellow fever contracted from the West African coast, where the virus is believed to have originated centuries earlier and traveled to the Americas along the same routes as the slave trade that the Balama colonists had explicitly set out to oppose. Generations of exposure had given West African populations partial resistance that European settlers simply didn't carry. Within months, the death toll among the colonists was severe enough that the venture was no longer viable. By November of 1792, the surviving colonists abandoned the settlement, and the Hankey turned back toward the Atlantic, carrying sick passengers and almost certainly infected mosquitoes breeding in her water casks. It's not a straight line from Balama to Philadelphia. The Hankey worked its way through Caribbean ports first, according to historian Billy Smith's account in his book on the epidemic, and at nearly every stop, fever broke out shortly after she'd been in harbor. By the time she crossed into American waters and up the eastern seaboard, she had in effect been seeding outbreaks behind her the whole way. Now, here's where the two threads meet. Both the Saint-Domingue refugee ships and the Hankey, on two completely separate voyages that began on two different continents for two completely unrelated reasons, arrived in the port of Philadelphia within roughly the same window in the summer of 1793. Neither one, on its own, might have been enough. Philadelphia had seen yellow fever before, decades earlier, and survived it without a citywide catastrophe. But 1793 added a third element that turned coincidence into disaster. The city itself was primed to burn. Philadelphia in 1793 was almost absurdly vulnerable to exactly this kind of outbreak, and almost none of it had to do with France or West Africa at all. Most of its roughly 50,000 residents lived packed within about 7 blocks of the Delaware River docks, dense, low-lying, close to standing water. The winter before had been unusually mild. The summer that followed was one of the hottest anyone could remember, and it left the city's streams and gutters dried down to stagnant puddles, perfect nurseries for mosquito larvae. And critically, it had been roughly 30 years since Philadelphia's last serious yellow fever outbreak, which meant almost nobody in the city carried any immunity to it at all. So picture the geometry of it. A dense, low-port city with no collective immunity, sitting through the hottest summer in memory, full of stagnant water. And into that tinderbox arrive, independently, 2 separate ships that had each spent months acting as floating incubators for the same virus and the same mosquito species. Neither captain planned it, neither government intended it. It happened because the Atlantic world in 1793 was small enough and interconnected enough for a slave revolution in the Caribbean and a failed colony in West Africa to end up finishing each other's sentence on the same American riverfront. Let's get specific, because the vague version of this story tends to blur together events that actually happened in a fairly tight, traceable sequence. The first confirmed deaths came in early August 1793 at a boarding house on North Water Street run by a man named Richard Denny. Within days, 4 boarders and 2 of Denny's own household workers died after developing high fevers, seizures, and the disease's signature later symptom: vomiting a thick black substance caused by internal bleeding, along with jaundiced, yellowing skin, which is where the disease gets its name. According to one contemporary account, the 2 earliest fatalities in the city were recent arrivals themselves. One an Irish immigrant, the other a refugee from Saint-Domingue, both dying in temporary lodgings within blocks of the port they'd just landed at. City officials didn't wait long to draw a conclusion, and the conclusion they drew tells you almost as much about Philadelphia's politics in 1793 as it does about the disease itself. Believing the fever had arrived with the Saint-Domingue refugees, the city imposed a quarantine of roughly 2 to 3 weeks on new immigrants and their cargo. It was functionally too late and too weak to matter. City officials couldn't enforce it consistently, even as the epidemic accelerated through August, and by the time the quarantine order existed on paper, the virus and its mosquito carriers were already established in the city's water supply. Part of the problem was that nobody understood the actual mechanism of transmission, so the quarantine targeted the wrong thing entirely. Officials were watching for sick people disembarking from ships. Nobody was watching for mosquito eggs in a water barrel, because nobody yet connected mosquitoes to fever at all. That link wouldn't be scientifically established for another century. So while the city congratulated itself on inspecting incoming passengers, the actual vector of the disease was breeding, undisturbed, in cisterns and rain barrels within the harbor itself. What made the disease so frightening, beyond the death toll, was who it killed. Unlike most fevers of the era, which hit hardest among infants and the elderly, yellow fever's early victims in Philadelphia were disproportionately young adults and heads of households, the working population of the dockside wards, the people least able to simply pack up and leave. Symptoms followed a brutal, recognizable pattern, a sudden high fever, then a deceptive period of apparent recovery, followed in the worst cases by the return of fever alongside internal bleeding, the telltale black vomit and jaundice that gave the disease its name. By the numbers, the scale of what followed is hard to overstate. Between August and November of 1793, yellow fever killed more than 5,000 people in a city of 50,000, roughly 1 in 10 residents. Somewhere around 20,000 more fled to the countryside, more than a third of the population emptying entire streets and shutting down the machinery of a national government that was at that moment still headquartered in the city. To put that mortality rate in plain terms, if a disease today killed 1 in 10 residents of a major American city in 3 months, it would be, by a wide margin, the deadliest urban catastrophe in the country's modern history. Let that sink in for a moment. The doctors of Philadelphia, meanwhile, were locked in a bitter dispute over what was even causing the deaths, and the argument split almost perfectly along political lines. Dr. Benjamin Rush, the city's most prominent physician, insisted the fever originated locally, born from rotting coffee and contaminated air near the docks, essentially a local sanitation failure, nothing imported at all. Other physicians, and much of the city's political establishment, blamed the French refugees directly, treating the outbreak as evidence that the newcomers themselves were dangerous. Historian Martin Pernick has argued that the medical community's split over contagion theory tracked closely with existing partisan alignment. Federalists, more urban and more suspicious of the French, tended to blame the refugees. Their political opponents, more sympathetic to France and more skeptical of centralized authority, tended to side with Russia's local environmental explanation. That divide wasn't academic. It shaped who got quarantined, who got blamed, and who got left to die without help, because the cause of the fever had become a proxy war for an argument the country was already having about France, about the French Revolution, and about roughly 3,000 French immigrants who'd arrived in the city that same year, most of them, as it happened, fleeing not Paris but Saint-Domingue. Here's the paradox in all of this. Russia's local environmental theory, bad air, rotting produce, no foreign villain required, was in a strange way closer to being politically generous toward the refugees, even though it was medically wrong about the actual cause. Meanwhile, the Federalists who blamed the French were closer to the truth in one narrow sense. A ship from Saint-Domingue likely did carry fever into the city, while being completely wrong about the deeper mechanism. Since they had no framework for mosquitoes as vectors and no idea a second, unrelated ship from West Africa might have been doing the same thing at the same time. Nobody in this argument, whichever side they landed on, was working with anything close to the full picture. Meanwhile, the disease didn't care whose theory was correct. It moved through the dockside neighborhoods first, then inward. It killed the wealthy and the poor at close to the same rate, though the wealthy were far better positioned to simply leave. And it killed some of the most powerful men in the country's new government, almost. Now let me introduce you to something that most accounts of 1793 either skip entirely or mention in a single passing sentence. The ship that may have started an entirely separate chain of the outbreak, 4,000 miles from where everyone was looking. The hanky doesn't appear in most popular retellings of Philadelphia's epidemic at all. When it's mentioned, it's usually a footnote to the Saint-Domingue refugee story, if it's mentioned at all. But historian Billy Smith, in his account of the epidemic, makes the case that the hanky's voyage deserves to be treated as a parallel origin point, not an afterthought. Here's why that matters. If the epidemic's only source was the Saint-Domingue refugee fleet, then the popular framing, French refugees brought the fever, is at least directionally correct, even if it oversimplifies a humanitarian catastrophe into an accusation. But if the hanky independently seeded fever into Caribbean and American ports on a voyage that began in West Africa, months before most of the Saint-Domingue refugees ever boarded a ship, then the French brought it narrative collapses into something closer to coincidence than causation. The hanky had left Britain in 1792 carrying colonists for the doomed Balama settlement, a well-intentioned, badly researched attempt to establish a free colony off the West African coast, a region where yellow fever is believed to have originated and where the local population had built up generations of exposure that the British settlers simply didn't have. Disease devastated the settlement within months. By November, the survivors abandoned it, and the ship turned back across the Atlantic. What happened next reads almost like a slow-motion trail of wreckage. The hanky worked her way through port after port in the Caribbean on her way home, and at stop after stop, outbreaks of fever followed shortly after she'd anchored. She wasn't accused at the time. Nobody was tracking ship movements against disease outbreaks with that kind of precision in 1793, but in retrospect, her route maps almost exactly onto a chain of yellow fever flare-ups that stretched from West Africa to the eastern seaboard of the United States. By the time she reached American waters, the hanky had, in effect, been running an unintentional, months-long experiment in exactly how contagious and mobile this disease could be when carried inside a wooden hull full of standing water. And Philadelphia, sitting at the northern end of her route, was simply the last, largest, and most vulnerable city she touched. This is the detail that should genuinely unsettle you about the popular version of this story. The two ships that likely brought yellow fever to Philadelphia in 1793 had nothing to do with each other. One carried desperate refugees fleeing a slave revolution their own country had failed to suppress. The other carried idealistic settlers fleeing the collapse of a colony built on a misunderstanding of West African disease ecology. Blaming either group as the singular cause erases the other entirely, and erases the deeper truth, which is that yellow fever's arrival in Philadelphia wasn't really about who was on which ship. It was about how tightly the Atlantic world's shipping lanes, colonial ventures, and refugee routes had already been woven together by 1793, long before anyone in Philadelphia had reason to care. Think about what that actually means for how we tell this story. Philadelphians in 1793 needed a villain, and the Saint-Domingue refugees were right there, visible, speaking a foreign language, arriving in visible waves that anyone on the docks could count. The hanky was invisible by comparison, a British merchant vessel among dozens moving through the harbor that season, its West African detours and its trail of Caribbean outbreaks, not something any Philadelphian in 1793 had any way of tracing. It's not that officials chose to blame the French instead of the hanky. It's that one thread of the story was visible and politically convenient, and the other simply wasn't visible at all, until historians went looking for it 2 centuries later. That gap between what was politically convenient to blame and what actually happened is the gap this whole video is trying to close. Zoom out from Philadelphia's docks for a moment, because the fever that hit that city in 1793 was not in any sense a uniquely American event. It was one visible flare-up in a much larger ongoing catastrophe unfolding across the entire Atlantic basin that same decade. At the same time French soldiers were dying by the thousands trying to suppress the Haitian Revolution, Britain was fighting its own catastrophic campaign in the Caribbean, driven partly by an attempt to seize French colonial territory amid the chaos. Historian David Geggus, writing on the British occupation of Saint-Domingue, estimates that roughly 50,000 British soldiers and sailors died in the West Indies during this period, with a comparable number discharged as invalids. Casualty figures that dwarfed anything Britain lost to actual combat in the same theater. That's the scale we're actually talking about. Yellow fever in the 1790s wasn't a Philadelphia problem that happened to have a French twist. It was killing tens of thousands of European soldiers across the Caribbean, reshaping the military balance of an entire colonial war, and riding the same trade routes, troop transports, and refugee ships that were already carrying the political and economic shockwaves of revolution back and forth across the Atlantic. Britain's occupation of Saint-Domingue, remember, was itself opportunistic, an attempt to seize French colonial territory while France was consumed by revolution at home and rebellion in its colonies. That's worth sitting with for a second. The same power vacuum that sent refugees streaming toward Philadelphia was simultaneously drawing a rival empire into a disastrous military campaign 4,000 miles away, and both events were being driven by the exact same underlying collapse. Philadelphia's epidemic wasn't a separate story from Britain's catastrophic losses in the Caribbean. It was the same disease, moving along the same shipping lanes, following the same collapsing colonial order, just landing on a different shore. And American port cities knew it. When Philadelphia's epidemic became undeniable, neighboring cities didn't respond with sympathy so much as self-preservation. Baltimore and New York both imposed quarantines against ships and goods coming out of Philadelphia, even as New York, in a strange split gesture, also sent financial aid south to help the stricken capital. Some smaller towns near Philadelphia refused entry to fleeing residents outright, afraid they were carrying the fever with them. In other words, the same Atlantic system that had delivered the disease to Philadelphia in the first place was now actively working to contain and isolate the city, the way a body isolates an infection. Trade routes that had connected Saint-Domingue, West Africa, the Caribbean, and the eastern seaboard into a single interconnected disease environment were now being selectively severed. A reminder that the very interconnectedness that made 1793 possible could just as easily be shut off when a city became a liability instead of a market. Step back from ships and trade routes for a moment, because underneath all of it were individual people making impossible choices in real time. Alexander Hamilton, the country's Treasury Secretary and the architect of its new financial system, caught the fever himself in early September along with his wife and recovered under a cold bath treatment recommended by an old friend, Dr. Edward Stevens, whom Hamilton had known since his childhood in the Caribbean. He was fortunate not just to survive, but to have the means to leave the city afterward and recuperate upstate while the epidemic still raged around those who couldn't. Hamilton later wrote to Philadelphia's College of Physicians, personally recommending Stevens's treatment method. A small footnote that nonetheless shows how much the epidemic's medical response was still being shaped, informally, by which prominent men happened to survive, and which doctors happened to be their personal friends. Most residents didn't have that option. And when the city's own institutions began to buckle under the weight of the dying, When white residents fled in numbers and the machinery of city government essentially stopped functioning, it was Philadelphia's free black community that stepped into the vacuum. Richard Allen, co-founder of what would become the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and his fellow minister Absalom Jones organized volunteers to nurse the sick and remove the dead, work that most of the city's remaining residents refused to do out of fear of the disease themselves. This wasn't a small symbolic gesture. It was sustained, dangerous physical labor performed for months by a community that had every reason to expect no gratitude for it, and got none. At the time, a widely circulated belief held that black Philadelphians were somehow naturally immune to yellow fever, a myth with no basis in medicine that nonetheless made it easier for the city to lean on black volunteers for the most dangerous work, carrying the sick, handling the dead, entering houses that white neighbors had nailed shut out of fear. Black Philadelphians, it's worth noting clearly, were not spared by the fever. They died at roughly the same rate as white residents, around 240 people by later counts, even as some of the very people they'd risked their lives to nurse later accused the black community of profiteering from the crisis. Allen and Jones would go on to publish their own account of the epidemic, directly rebutting those accusations, in one of the earliest published works by black authors in the country's history. That's the longer-term consequence worth sitting with. An epidemic born out of a slave revolution 4,000 miles away ended in Philadelphia, with the city's free black community performing the labor that held the capital together during its worst crisis, only to then have to publicly defend their own honesty in the crisis's aftermath. So here's where all of this actually lands, because none of it is really a contradiction. It was about mosquitoes breeding in stagnant Philadelphia puddles during an unusually hot, dry summer. And it was also about a slave revolution in Saint-Domingue and a failed colonial venture in West Africa, sending two independent, unrelated ships toward the same Atlantic port within months of each other. These two statements are not contradictory. They are complementary. The popular version of this story isn't factually wrong about the mosquitoes, the heat, or the doctor's ignorance of contagion. What it gets wrong is the framing, treating 1793 as an isolated American misfortune, a local sanitation failure that happened to a young country before it knew better. The real story is that Philadelphia in 1793 sat at the receiving end of an Atlantic world already densely wired together by trade, colonization, and revolution, and that wiring is precisely what let a slave uprising in the Caribbean and a failed settlement in West Africa finish, almost simultaneously, in an American capital neither event had anything to do with on its own terms. It was about Benjamin Rush's genuine, if wrong, medical convictions about bad air and rotting coffee. And it was also about those convictions conveniently lining up with his political sympathies, in a city where medicine and party politics had become nearly impossible to separate. It was about a quarantine policy that failed. And it was also about that policy targeting the visible threat, refugee ships, while missing the invisible one entirely. That's the real thesis of this whole story. 1793 wasn't a medical mystery visited on an innocent city. It was what happens when a fragile new nation's capital sits directly in the path of forces it never saw coming, because those forces were never really about that nation at all. That pattern didn't end in 1793, and it's worth naming plainly because it's still the pattern today. Modern outbreaks, from mosquito-borne disease resurging along old shipping and trade corridors to pathogens moving along the exact routes carved by war, migration, and global commerce, follow the same underlying logic. Disease doesn't respect the borders we draw around our crisis versus someone else's crisis. It moves along whatever connective tissue already exists between places, and in an increasingly interconnected world, that tissue only gets denser, not thinner. Consider how closely the 1793 pattern maps onto more recent history. A regional conflict or economic collapse displaces large numbers of people quickly. Those people move through the same shipping and travel networks that also carry cargo, trade, and invisibly, disease vectors. And the receiving city or country, already strained by its own internal conditions, ends up blaming the visible newcomers rather than tracing the full tangled set of roots that actually converged on its doorstep. It's a pattern that shows up again and again, wherever a health crisis meets an existing political fault line. The visible cause becomes the accepted cause, and the invisible one, the trade route, the shipping lane, the pre-existing vulnerability, quietly does most of the actual work. Philadelphia in 1793 didn't get unlucky in isolation. It got caught in the crossfire of an Atlantic world it was already inextricably a part of. A world where a plantation uprising in the Caribbean, a failed abolitionist colony in West Africa, and a fragile new nation's half-built capital could all end up sharing the same summer, the same docks, and the same 5,000 graves. If there's one thing this story should leave you with, it's this. The next time a health crisis is described as coming from somewhere else, it's worth asking what invisible thread of trade, migration, or history actually connects that somewhere else to right where you're standing. Usually there's more than one. If you found this useful, consider liking the video and subscribing for more of these deep dives into the hidden economic and historical forces behind events we think we already understand. I'd genuinely like to know, what's another well-known historical disaster you think deserves this same kind of second look? Drop it in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.